At long last, it's finally October. The month of Halloween, the season of the witch, the true apex of autumn. But most importantly, it's open season for every last horror, terror, beast, cryptid, and creature who wants to come out and flex their claws. This time of year is the festival celebrating our favorite beings, monsters, the supernatural forces that make life exciting and get night minds racing. In October, we can throw boring, everyday life nonsense to the mercy of legendary killers and incredible terrors. The forces of dark imagination and creative thinking rule in this season. As a newly freed creature of the night myself, I thought this year would be the perfect opportunity to celebrate the festival here online, and maybe bring the Night Mind mission statement of revealing awesome undiscovered items to the party. You've heard of Slender Man, you know the Rake, and as for Jeff the Killer, come on guys, don't make me laugh. Forget the scary spaghetti and let's celebrate some real legends of horror. It's time to get offline and into the field. Strap on your guns, grab your flashlights, and make sure all of your camera batteries are fully charged. This is the Night Mind Monster Hunt. Before we really get into the business of tracking down the supernatural, it's best for us to cut our teeth a little. Can't overburden some of our younger party members before they have proper experience. I pulled together 4 targets for tonight's hunting party, all of them older than anything you'll find online by several decades, and for 1 or 2 of them, a few hundred years or so. Each monster in the field is based in reality, whether it's a tale that's been passed down through the ages or a story that actually is based on true events. All of our targets have left behind documented trails. It's worth noting that each of them have been cited to make appearances right around this time of year. Keep your senses sharp. If you see anything out of the corner of your eye or hear any strange noises, you might just want to take a moment to check them out. After all, speak of the devil and he shall appear. Which is actually the plan for our very first target. What better way to lure him out of hiding after so many decades underground? Our first location in the hunt is the birthplace of many monster stories, Victorian England. While the centerpiece of the United Kingdom has faced quite a few killers and horrors over the years going by the name of Jack, the most famous of them, Jack the Ripper, had a predecessor that was much more horrifying and far more elusive. In September of 1837, the police were alerted to several attacks on women in the area of London. The victims all cited being assaulted by some kind of man who came out of nowhere, but he didn't quite seem to be a man. This person, if it was one, appeared to be very pale and had flesh that was icy cold and clammy. His fingers ended in claws that were sharp and hard as iron, an attribute described by victim Polly Adams, whose dress was torn open and stomach scratched in one swipe of the attacker's hand. This was confirmed by Mary Stevens, attacked on her way home through Clapham Common in October of 1837. She joined the other victims in describing the attacker as tall and thin, wearing a very dark black cloak. Those who got a good look at his face reported him having pointed ears like devil horns and glowing eyes. What all victims noticed about him, even if they didn't see his face, is what earned the assailant his name. Whenever he appeared, it would almost be as if he came from the sky or burst from the shadows, and when he made his escape, he would jump impossibly high, even to the point of leaping over fences and walls as tall as 9 feet. During one assault, he jumped into a roadway at night, attacking a stagecoach driver, crashing the carriage and then disappearing, laughing as he escaped. The police had been hesitant to make the first few reports public because it sounded insane, but when the attacks began to pile up without there being a public announcement to fuel false reports, they knew something very disturbing really was happening. They went public with what they knew, urging citizens of London to be on the lookout, and shortly after, several people came forward who had been afraid to submit reports. They didn't want to sound like they were going mad, but with the officials aware this was happening, they knew they would finally be taken seriously about the monster people of London had begun calling Spring-Heeled Jack. In January of 1938, the Lord Mayor of London declared Spring-Heeled Jack to be a public menace, and he organized vigilante groups to form patrols each night in hopes of catching the criminal. A few of these patrols apparently did run into him, but Jack was far too fast for them and had a supernatural way of moving. Patrols learned firsthand why he was called Spring-Heeled Jack. More attacks and more sightings continued, but began to fade out, and as these reports lightened up, so did the patrols. This was proven to be a major mistake. On the night of February 19th, Jane Alsop heard a man outside the house yelling. When she called out to him to ask what was wrong, he yelled back, "For God's sake, bring me a light. We've caught Spring-Heeled Jack in the lane." Jane took a candle and went outside immediately. There was somebody in the lane, and she hurried to his side. By the glow of the candle, she began to realize her mistake as the flame illuminated a long black cloak worn by a man with very pale skin. The quote from the London Times article reporting the event later read as follows: "He threw off his outer garment and applying the lighted candle to his breast presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, and vomited forth a quantity of blue and white flame from his mouth, and his eyes resembled red balls of fire. He wore a large helmet, and his dress, which appeared to fit him very tight, seemed to her to resemble white oilskin." He attacked Jane Alsop, tearing at her dress with the same iron-hard claws described by the other women. Jane struggled as much as she could, crying for help, which alerted her sister, who came running outside and managed to fend off Jack. They ran into the house and locked the door, only to be met with a fierce knocking and taunting language just outside. Someone upstairs began yelling out a window to alert the police, and Jack escaped, leaving Jane and her sister to try and recuperate after what they'd just been through, with Jane needing plenty of treatment for the long scratches and claw wounds on her face, throat, and torso. The police, who had been getting used to hearing and seeing so little of the attacker, thought that it couldn't get much worse. 8 days later, an 18-year-old woman named Lucy Scales and her sister were heading home through Green Dragon Alley when they encountered a person in a large cloak hiding in a small space between buildings. There was no chance for Lucy. Her sister watched in horror as the figure stepped out, came right up to her, and blew a gust of fire directly into her face. She was rendered temporarily blind and had violent seizures for several hours after the incident. No sightings occurred for over a year after this, and though the police had begun listing persons of interest, they couldn't make a full arrest. Their inability to apprehend Spring-Heeled Jack led to the first murder they could directly connect him with. In 1845, during the daytime and in view of many people who reported the same event, Spring-Heeled Jack leapt onto a bridge where Maria Davis, a young prostitute, was making her way across. Without a word, he grabbed her by the shoulders, breathed fire into her face, and threw her off the bridge into an open sewer below. Spring-Heeled Jack made his escape before anyone could move to take him down or rescue Maria. Sightings actually stopped after this, and nothing occurred for 30 years. In 1872, events began again with reports of young women being attacked, and even a sighting at a military camp in Aldershot, Hampshire. A soldier on guard duty was attacked, and though he and some fellow guards fired their guns at him, none of the bullets actually seemed to hit the attacker. He disappeared, moving at a shocking speed and jumping with incredible height. Spring-Heeled Jack was spotted in Lincolnshire of 1877 during autumn, and again he was shot at, but there was no effect. He escaped his pursuers and leapt out of sight. There have been some reports throughout the years of Spring-Heeled Jack in the United States as well, and of course, he was still seen during odd appearances in England, but by and large, the sightings have stopped. The police had their theories about him being a nobleman whose behavior was a lot more like a young street urchin's, but there was no way of explaining how effective his costume was, the iron-hard claws, the ability to breathe fire, and of course, what seemed like the ability to nearly fly and move at shocking speeds. Experiments were conducted to try making spring-heel boots just to see if it was a mechanical trick, but all efforts led to participants breaking or spraining their ankles. Whatever Spring-Heeled Jack was, he had knowledge of engineering and invention well beyond the time period he lived in, or he really was beyond the realm of a mortal man in ways too horrifying for people to accept. It's always going to be up for debate about what Spring-Heeled Jack actually was, but we know that he was never caught, and if he's still out there, he's extremely dangerous. Any attempts to catch this monster should actually involve an exorcism kit. If this really is a kind of devil that we're dealing with, a few holy implements ought to bring some results. And just in case those past few sightings were reported by gunmen with bad aim, carry something you've had practice at shooting. Maybe you'll be lucky enough to land a shot after all these years. Our next stop takes us to a location I'm sure a lot of you won't be surprised we're visiting. After all, New Jersey is a hotbed of supernatural activity, and monsters love calling this place home. This time, we're tracking a very familiar name with a serious case of mistaken identity. I hope you're ready to set some records straight. Most people who hear the name Grinning Man associate it with the latest story about a sinister smiling figure, the creepypasta responsible for inspiring this popular image. And while the character has become widely known as a creepypasta monster, don't let anybody tell you that the Grinning Man comes from that story. The Grinning Man was already a much older legend, based on real reports of an encounter with a very unnerving otherworldly figure. The true origin of the Grinning Man dates back to the first week of October 1966 in the town of Elizabeth, New Jersey. The police had issued a notice to the residents of the area to be on the lookout for anything strange. They had received a report by a middle-aged man from a neighborhood near 4th Street that he had been chased by a tall man wearing a strange green jacket. This coincided with reports by sudden acts of violence in the area, putting everybody on guard against any strangers they might encounter. On the night of October 11th, two boys, Marvin and James, were walking home on 4th Street when they stopped at a corner parallel to the New Jersey Turnpike. At this corner, there was an incline leading up to the turnpike, which anyone could use to run from 4th Street onto the highway, so the state had placed a very tall wire fence to prohibit access. Streetlights above lit the area every few yards, allowing just enough visibility for the boys to walk safely. They had been about to cross the street when James paused, seeing something behind the fence where no person should be. It was a tall figure facing away from them. James asked Marvin, "Who's that guy standing behind you?" Marvin looked back to see what his friend was talking about, and when both boys were looking, the tall figure turned and came into the light. He met their gaze and grinned. A wide, full grin, wider than any normal smile. His eyes were small and set far too wide apart on a head with no hair at all. The two boys remembered their parents had told them there was a neighborhood watch for strangers after the attack by the man in the green jacket. They backed away from the corner and ran, not stopping until they found an authority figure to report what they saw. It wasn't until they had gotten over their initial terror and calmed down that they remembered the most disturbing details. The man they witnessed didn't have a nose or ears. He was far bigger than any normal man, and he had been wearing a green bodysuit. And while children do have a tendency to share exciting personal stories when the adults are all talking about strange activity, the next report came from an older man whose story arrived at a very interesting time. November 2nd, 1966, just a few weeks after the sighting in New Jersey. Woodrow Derenberger was a salesman for a sewing machine company who had been traveling home from the town of Marietta, Ohio. He was driving down Highway I-77 around 7:30 through the town of Parkersburg when a speeding car nearly hit him on its way past, and... well, actually, perhaps you'd like to hear what happened from Woodrow himself.
And just before I came to the intersection of Route 47, there was a car past me, overtaking me from behind, and following closely behind this car was this unidentified flying object, and as the car ahead, or the car behind passed me, this object was following close behind it, and it swerved directly in front of my truck, turning crosswise. And when it turned crosswise, it slowed down. It started slowing, not abruptly or too fast, but it gave me plenty of time to step on my brakes and slow down with it. But it forced me to come to a complete stop. As soon as I had stopped, there was a door opened in the side of this vehicle, and this man stepped out and came directly to me, or came to the truck. He walked to the right-hand side of the truck, and he told me to roll down the window. He asked me to roll down the window on my right-hand side of my truck. And I had done what he asked. And this man stood there, and he first asked me what I was called. And I knew he meant my name, and I told him my name. And he asked me, he said, "Why are you frightened?" He said, "Don't be frightened, we wish you no harm." He said, "We mean you no harm, we wish you only happiness." And I told him my name, and when I told him my name, he said he was called Cold. That was the name that he was called by. And again, he told me not to be frightened, which I was. I was very frightened. And as far as I can understand, this was all mental. There was no spoken words from him. I knew what he was asking me, but yet he stood there and his mouth did not move. He had a smile on his face. He appeared very courteous and friendly. And after I talked with him a while, he told me he would see me. He said, "We will see you again," and he left in his vehicle.
Now, Mr. Dernberger, for the sake of our television...
Woodrow also reported the man he encountered to be very tall and wearing a green bodysuit. He did not stop smiling throughout the encounter and spoke to him using only telepathy. Is the reality of the grinning man closer to alien encounter stories than evil stranger attacks? It just might be. But besides the trademark eerie grin and incidents of random violence reported around the time of the New Jersey sighting, there's very little about the documented encounters that can be found in the popular creepypasta. Instead of encounters with smiling strangers, the internet horror story just involves the image of the grinning man found in an email attachment, which, when paired with a certain word, causes the viewer to have nightmares about the monster and then go insane, murdering those living in their household before then killing themselves. The creepypasta relays the tale of a man who went to visit a friend at his apartment, but this apartment was surrounded by police who informed the main character that the man inside had killed his roommate and then himself. After somehow remembering the password his friend used for his email address, which the friend shared with him as, you know, all college-age friends who don't even live together naturally do, the main character finds an email opened by his friend half an hour before his murder-suicide with no subject, the image of the grinning man, and a single word. He has many nightmares about the grinning man, blood, murder, and dying, and wakes up one night realizing he's killed his dog with a knife, which led to him writing about his story to the reader, begging for help before he ends up killing his wife and then himself, sharing the same fate as his friend. When you consider the actual legend of the grinning man and the creepypasta, there's much more fun to be found in the real reports of this monster. The creepypasta is really just the same exact story as Smile Dog using an email instead of a floppy disk. There's plenty of mystery to be found in the real case of the grinning man, and I suspect there are stories of encounters we still haven't heard. Whoever he was, he'd been hanging around the area for well over a month, and had frightened enough people for the story to get around. The sudden rise in violence noted by police coincided directly with the appearance of the grinning man in New Jersey, and a correlation like that is not something to ignore. Woodrow Derenberger may not have been harmed in his encounter, but if you come across a grinning man who doesn't look quite human, it's better to be safe than sorry. Because we know so little about how the grinning man operates and what he actually is, be prepared to turn and run, or you might be fighting something we'll discover can't be hurt using ordinary means. However, if you're up to the task of taking him in, get ready to pull out all the stops, and if your own mental willpower isn't enough to resist the psychic attack, send in someone who's not going to be affected by telepathy. Our third target is one that you might already know, depending on how much monster research you do yourself. We're not walking too far away from New Jersey. In fact, we're just going to hop on Interstate 295 southbound and pick up I-95 for a very short journey into the calm, quiet state of Virginia, where a local legend has inspired many would-be monster hunters to do exactly the same thing. Coming straight from the rejected slasher villain concepts of the 80s and landing right onto our hit list, this is one story you won't be sharing on Easter Sunday. The tale of the Bunny Man has all the makings of a Hollywood adaptation. Serial killer, urban legend, mainstream exposure, and a true story involved. Or a pair of true stories anyway. Our hunt takes us to Fairfax County, Virginia, where an ordinary bridge has received some extraordinary attention over the past few years. Colchester Overpass is the worst area in the state during October. State officials and local police have become used to the stress of turning away hundreds of people since 2003 around Halloween, all of whom have come to see the infamous Bunny Man Bridge. sometimes wearing a full white rabbit costume and in other stories wearing a bunny mask. This murderer has been appearing since the early 1900s to defend his land against trespassers, and usually shows up to perform the task of enforcing his territory around Halloween, when the spirits of the beyond can become flesh and blood. The Bunny Man greets unsuspecting victims with a hatchet or axe, appearing from the dark and striking before they realize they're on private property. Bodies of victims have been hung from the bridge, making it clear what happens to anyone who comes to challenge the Bunny Man's ownership over his land. At least, that's how the legend goes, and it only covers what's been going on since the 1900s. The rest of it, Bunny Man's origin, goes a little something like this. In the year 1904, an asylum for the criminally insane in Clifton, Virginia was closed down after pressure from the local population demanded relocation of inmates. Arrangements were made to move the prisoners to a more isolated facility outside the reach of suburban neighborhoods. During the process, one of the transports crashed, killing the driver and several inmates. 10 of them survived and attempted to escape. All of these prisoners were recaptured, except for one, Douglas J. Griffin. Search parties kept moving throughout the area, but the last inmate was never found. Shortly after, locals began reporting that the bodies of dead rabbits kept showing up on their property, all of them skinned, half of them eaten. Police conducted another search of the woods and found the remains of a man named Marcus Walster on some railroad tracks, the very tracks that would end up as the Colchester Overpass. This legend has two endings, one in which Douglas Griffin is never found, and one that claims police did find him, resulting in a chase. Douglas met his demise during the chase by running to the railroad tracks and throwing himself in front of the train. Reports concerning his time in the asylum reveal that he had been imprisoned for the murder of his family. Every few years since that time, bodies had been found hanging from the bridge and among the woods, tied to the trees. Some drivers going through Colchester Overpass report seeing a figure among the woods, or even swearing they saw someone in the tunnel just before entering. But where do the axe and hatchet come in, and what about the rabbit costume or mask? Those factors are the only true pieces in this true story, or at least what we can actually confirm with records that do exist. The real story of the Bunny Man actually started on October 22, 1970, with a headline in the Washington Post that seemed way too strange to be true. Man in bunny suit sought in Fairfax. Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett told police that shortly after midnight last Sunday, he and his fiancée were sitting in a car in the 5400 block of Guinea Road when a man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears ran from the nearby bushes and shouted, "You're on private property and I have your tag number." The rabbit threw a wooden handle hatchet through the right front car window, the first-year cadet told police. As soon as he threw the hatchet, the rabbit skipped off into the night. Bennett and his fiancée were not injured. Police say they have the hatchet, but no other clues in the case. They say Bennett was visiting an uncle who lives across the street from the spot where the car was parked. The cadet was in the area to attend last weekend's Air Force-Navy football game. This article was followed by another in the Washington Post, printed on October 31st, appropriately enough. The rabbit reappears. A man wearing a furry rabbit suit with two long ears appeared, again, on Guinea Road in Fairfax County Thursday night, police reported, this time wielding an axe and chopping away at a roof support on a new house. Less than 2 weeks ago, a man wearing what was described as a rabbit suit accused two persons in a parked car of trespassing and heaved a hatchet through a closed window of the car at 5400 Guinea Road. They were not hurt. Thursday night's rabbit, wearing a suit described as gray, black, and white, was spotted a block away at 5307 Guinea Road. Paul Phillips, a private security guard for a new construction company, said he saw the rabbit standing on the front porch of a new but unoccupied house. "I started talking to him," Phillips said, "and that's when he started chopping." "All you people trespass around here," Phillips said the rabbit told him as he whacked 8 gashes in the pole. "If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust your head." Phillips said he walked back to his car to get his handgun, but the rabbit, carrying the long-handled axe, ran off into the woods. The security guard said the man was about 5'8", 160 pounds, and appeared to be in his early 20s. An investigation by Brian A. Conley for the records of Fairfax County led to additional documents relating to these events, and actually confirmed they were legitimate through police files. A report of investigation had been made as a result of the second event involving an axe, which had taken place on October 29th at 10:30 p.m. at 5307 Guinea Road. 6 officers reported in after receiving a call and were told to look for a subject dressed as a rabbit with an axe. No subject was found, and the case was handed off to an investigator who later received an interesting phone call. Someone working at the construction site where the attack took place dialed the number for the investigator, reporting that he had just been called by a man claiming to be responsible for the attack. He said, "You have been messing up my property by dumping tree stumps, limbs, and brush and other things. You can make everything right by meeting me tonight and talking about the situation." A stakeout had been performed under the conditions outlined for meeting that caller, but he never showed up. Construction on the neighborhood development went on as planned in the area, and the case went cold. Meanwhile, the town and surrounding areas kept word of mouth circulating about the Bunny Man, and while many people began sharing stories about new sightings, nothing official was ever reported to police, printed in newspapers, or shared over TV and radio. As far as investigation into the legend is concerned, there have been no records of an asylum in the area that was torn down, and no Douglas J. Griffin listed anywhere. There has been criminal activity and plenty of murder in the woods around the area since the early 1900s, but no details about bodies being hung from the bridge. And yet, right next door in Tennessee, there's another story to be considered: the Rabbit Man of Unicoi Forest. Locals relay the story as something going a bit like this. In the 1930s, a man named George Sherwin lived in a small cabin settled in the woods. The area was home to many rabbits, and the population, while healthy enough when George moved in, started to really grow when he began feeding them daily, leaving food around the property and creating a friendly enough environment that rabbits would approach the cabin. On October 7, 1935, officials from the state arrived to inform George that he had to stop feeding these rabbits. The population spike was resulting in a pest control issue, and there were health hazards involved in keeping some of the rabbits he had taken in as pets. On Halloween night of that year, 3 drunken teenagers were walking through the woods on their way back from a party and came across George's cabin. George hadn't expected trick-or-treaters and was quite surprised to be hearing noise outside of his house. He had opened a window just in time to hear one of the boys, the most intoxicated of the 3, making fun of George's rabbit hoarding, calling him Rabbit Man. He threw a beer bottle at one of the cages, shattering it and getting glass all over the rabbits inside. One of the others began shaking the cage, asking if they were scared. They never saw George coming from behind the house, rope in one hand and a hammer in the other, 3 railroad spikes in the pocket of his jacket. One by one, he tied them up and drove a railroad spike straight through the hearts of the first 2 boys. The third had just enough time as the others were being killed to pull himself free of the rope and escaped. He didn't stop running until he found a police officer, and they went up to George Sherwin's cabin immediately. When they arrived, they found a well in the back that contained the bodies of the teenagers, and beneath them, several dead rabbits. George Sherwin was nowhere to be found. Since this event, there have been scattered reports of seeing the Rabbit Man, and seeing an actual rabbit man, a big, hulking hybrid abomination of a black rabbit and a human being. Though there are only a few details that connect the Bunny Man and Rabbit Man, it is interesting how these stories have grown in states that share a border. Cross-contamination of urban legends? Maybe. There are elements of the more well-known story we do know are true, however. We know for sure that in Virginia, there really was a Bunny Man. He did threaten people with an axe and a hatchet trying to defend his land. He was definitely unstable enough to attack or even murder trespassers. He was never caught, and he showed up right around Halloween. Is there more to this legend that records might reveal to be true? Perhaps. But for now, if you live anywhere near Clifton, Virginia, stay far away from Bunny Man's Bridge this Halloween. The police cars patrolling this local sightseeing hotspot are the same ones keeping us from meeting this undead serial killer. A bit more research and a few backroom conversations later, and we might just be able to perform supernatural pest elimination for Clifton's mayor in a couple of years. But for tonight, I am afraid that we have to move on. Our final monster is one that you've definitely heard of, even if you weren't aware of it. Every year, right around this time, you hear his name. There's no specific location for this one. Everybody needs to keep a lookout on Halloween night. The oldest, most dangerous, and widely celebrated target on our monster hunt. This is the story behind Halloween's greatest icon. Jack-o'-lantern is, depending which legend that you hear, a malevolent monster spirit, a frightening lost soul, or a guide for the spirits that cross worlds on Halloween nights. There are slight variations on the tale depending on what region you're hearing it in over in Europe, but one thing is agreed upon. Jack-o'-lantern used to be named Stingy Jack, and he wasn't the nicest man. Jack was a blacksmith and a raging alcoholic. He was the town drunk, and everybody knew it. A greedy, selfish trickster, Jack spent his years drinking, stealing, and cheating people out of money. Every story variant eventually leads to Jack encountering the devil, who he manages to trick using a crucifix. In the apple tree variant, Jack meets the devil when it's time for him to die, and because he's a drunken mess at the time, the trip to hell is long and very difficult. During the walk to hell, the devil and Jack cross an apple tree, and Jack makes one last request as a free soul, a single apple to satiate his hunger and sober him up a bit. The devil, seeing the delicious humor in retrieving an apple from a tree to feed a soul he's taking to hell, actually honors the request. While up in the tree, Jack pulls out a knife and carves a cross into the trunk, trapping the devil in its branches, who cannot pass through an area where a cross has been placed. Jack then offers the devil a deal. If he cuts away the cross and lets the devil come out of the tree, he would be allowed to continue living, and when his body gave out next time, he would not be taken to hell. Furious as he was, the devil did need to get out of the tree, and he agreed to the terms. Jack cut away the bark, removing the cross, and the two went their separate ways. The other variants have to do with Jack tricking the devil into becoming a coin. One story claims that Jack spent the last of his money ordering drinks in a bar, but didn't want to pay the bill, and proclaimed he would sell his soul to buy one more drink as if he didn't actually have the money. Upon hearing this, the devil appeared and offered to transform into a coin he could use. The second variant has Jack running away from someone he had stolen from in town, and when he called upon the devil to help him out, he struck a deal. If the devil turned into a coin he could use to pay the man chasing him, he would give up his soul, and the man, being a Christian, would be cheated out of payment by the devil when he turned back into himself after making the coin vanish. Both stories have the same conclusion. The devil turns into a coin, and Jack places it in his pocket, directly next to a cross. Unable to bear the pain of his proximity to a cross, the devil grants Jack another dose of life and freedom from hell if he takes him out of the pocket. Jack agrees to the terms and removes the coin. So, depending on which version of the story you hear, Jack pulls one over on the devil by using an apple or a false deal, but the next part is the same in every tale. Jack spends the rest of his years on Earth drinking, gambling, cheating, and generally being a horrible person until finally dying. Just as promised, the devil does not appear to escort him to hell, and Jack is able to follow the path of light to heaven. But when he arrives at the gate, St. Peter informs him he is far too wicked to enter. Rejected by heaven, Jack spends a bit of time wandering the darkness of the void before succumbing to the reality that only hell would accept him. With no alternative, he finds the glow of hell and follows it to the center. Jack approaches the devil, who is not happy to see him and refuses to let him in. He doesn't want to give Jack any more satisfaction, even if it is access to hell. But sensing one more opportunity to trick the devil, Jack stated that he couldn't go anywhere else. The darkness of the void behind him was too strong to find his way back to Earth and be a ghost. The devil decided to do Jack one more favor. He grabbed a flaming piece of coal from the grounds of hell and tossed it to him. Jack caught the burning coal and was instantly cursed, transforming him into a monstrous abomination with the glow of hellfire in his eyes. Somewhere between man and demon, rejected by heaven and hell, Jack had nowhere left to go but Earth, where no one could even make the mistake of seeing him as a ghost. He would always appear as a monster. Figuratively and literally burned by the coal the devil gave him, Jack no longer wanted to hold it in his hand, but couldn't throw it away. He needed it to light his path. His first action on Earth and the new eternal life he'd been granted was the same kind that put him in the situation he found himself. Jack snuck into someone's garden and stole a turnip, which he carved out and used as a container for the devil's hellfire coal. With only this newly fashioned lantern to guide him, Stingy Jack wandered the earth, a restless spirit who is now more horrible in death than he had ever been while alive. But where does a character like this figure into Halloween as a celebration? Well, as a restless spirit of the earth, Jack experiences the same power of crossing over as all others when the veil between worlds comes down on Halloween night. It's his very lantern that inspired the use of jack-o'-lanterns as we know it today. Many of the celebration traditions we have now come from Ireland, where the tale of Stingy Jack began. Knowing that so many fearsome spirits crossing over were afraid of Jack, those who celebrated the holiday hollowed out their own turnip lanterns. If evil spirits who feared Jack saw what might be his lantern ahead, they would turn back, and the people who made that lantern would be safe. Carving a terrifying face into it added even more effect. Because Jack had been turned into a monster and had hellfire raging through his body, a scary face with a wicked glow inside might make spirits think they were seeing him ahead. Just on a tangent, this is actually part of the reason that trick-or-treating is a popular tradition. If you dress up like one of the monsters, you either blend in or become scary enough to make evil spirits think twice about coming after you. The idea of visiting door to door stems from an old tradition of leaving out treats for wicked spirits in case the lanterns fail. If you can't scare them away, bribe them. And before this tactic was used as a bribe to get rid of scary visitors, it was a friendly offering by Celtic pagans who celebrated Samhain, the true name for Halloween. They would leave items from their harvest for the spirits they wanted to honor, believing that the kindness of sharing their very last resource of food would ensure they made it through winter. If the spirits and gods saw that they were kind and giving people, their harvest would last until spring, where they could raise a new crop. But coming back to the lantern, just like the variations of Jack's story and his current state are far and wide, so are the reasons that they're made. As so many who knew the tale of Stingy Jack and his lantern considered him and his fellow spirits barred from hurting the religious, those who were strong in a Catholic faith would carve lanterns to mock the spirits. Others, like the pagans who celebrated Samhain, made lanterns in order to honor a spirit, in the same way many religions light candles for the dead. Some lanterns were even made to attract those crossing over for a meeting between the living and dead, so they could all have a feast in honor of the harvest, where those offerings mentioned earlier would be presented to the higher powers. Some people made lanterns to help spirits see where they were going, and before the advent of widespread electric lighting, they were made to help trick-or-treaters see while going door to door. Jack-o'-lanterns became known as such because of the story of Stingy Jack, whose name eventually became known as Jack of the Lantern. That was bound to happen, as there were men whose job at the time was actually lighting and carrying lanterns when the sun went down. These men were called Jacks, and they were lantern boys. If you needed to travel at night, you would hire a Jack of the Lantern. You can see how easily Stingy Jack with his eternally burning turnip lantern would have grown to become Jack of the Lantern this way. The title sounds clever in the same way a good joke can be. It's now only called a Jack-o'-lantern because heavy regional accents broke down the phrase into just a few sounds over time. As for the whole conversion of using turnips to using pumpkins, that comes from so many Irish and English immigrants to North America finding that pumpkins were everywhere in the New World, and they were a lot bigger, easier to carve, and just generally more common. You could sacrifice a pumpkin or two during the harvest for the purpose of making jack-o'-lanterns and not worry about it. But as for the monster himself, where do we stand with him today? It depends who you ask, but there are 3 common ways the story meets up with our time. For some, Jack-o'-lantern has become an actual Jack-of-the-Lantern for the spirit world on Halloween, helping spirits of the beyond come to Earth safely with his lantern light and then guiding them back before sunrise. This is the only way he knows how to make amends for the evils he committed in life, and will continue making sure those who cross the void on Halloween always go back in order to earn the favor of God. Initially rejected by heaven, Jack has already been through hell, and one of these days, he's going to earn his way into the only place that he's never been. Some believe that Jack actually never learned from his mistakes. He's still the same unfriendly spirit, still lost in the dark and looking for something to occupy his time. On Halloween, when he gains the same opportunity to join the living for a night, it's unknown what he gets up to, but you can bet that there's alcohol involved. And finally, there are those who fear Jack in the same way that many people in the past believed other spirits did. Now an angry, selfish monster cursed by the devil, Jack takes out his rage on the living by luring them into the woods, swamps, and other isolated areas with his lantern. A wrathful and starving soul, he attacks with extreme violence, using his demonic form to tear victims apart and eat them. He's not getting another chance at a meal when the sun comes up again, and he's not going to be able to satiate his hunger again for a year if he fails to catch something. Rumor is, he's using the mocking jack-o'-lantern tradition to his advantage now, stealing one for himself to wear as a mask and blending into the environment. His eyes are filled with hellfire already. He doesn't need to light a candle to pull off the illusion. If you encounter Jack, there is only one thing that can save you: an offering of the most potent alcohol you can get your hands on. And considering most people won't have that on hand when they're investigating a strange light in the woods on Halloween, you're much better off not approaching jack-o'-lanterns that seem to be hanging out where there aren't any people. There's no telling where Jack will choose to cross over on Halloween night. He could be 100 miles away, or he may just be in your neighborhood, looking for a trick-or-treater who seems to have lost their parents. The joyful sight of a glowing jack-o'-lantern may be the greatest symbol for Halloween, but if the darkest ending of his story is the truth, you definitely don't want to meet the monster who inspired it. Unless you're one of us, in which case you'd better have that alcohol ready and plenty of it. Perhaps after all this time we can find out exactly what version of Jack's story is true and what he's up to now. Honestly, I can't think of a better way to spend Halloween than celebrating with the monster icon of the holiday himself. If you're brave enough to find him. Otherwise, I'd rather be right here with all of you at our own festival celebrating all of these creatures of the night. With all of our targets collected, I'd say this was a very successful hunt. Wait, did you think that we were actually going to kill any of them? Come on now, what's the fun in that? If you keep them alive, they can go on scaring people for decades to come. Besides, you've seen enough horror movies to know that the toughest monsters never die. Keeping the scares going and celebrating the supernatural is what this time of year is all about. That's all for tonight, everyone. Put away your gear and relax. We've had a good journey, and it's time to get a bit of rest. Halloween is coming, and you don't want to be tired for it. Be sure to show up when the sun goes down. I'll be waiting for you. Thanks again for joining me in the dark this evening, and thanks to all of my supporters on Patreon who make celebrations like these possible. Stick around to see the names of all of these awesome monster hunters. I hope you've enjoyed this experience, and even if you don't join us for the big night, I hope you have a very happy Halloween. Once more, I'm Nick Nocturne, and I'll be seeing you again real soon. Sleep tight.